All right, so we should be going live now. Facebook is setting up our first ever live stream with Dr. Ashraf El Fiky and Dr. Ahmed Rostom. We're all very excited to be hosting you here tonight in our first live stream on COVID-19, vaccines, testing, and global economy, a focus on Egypt. As you may all already know, we would love for you to ask your questions throughout this live event. So please comment your questions and we will be monitoring them as we go. Amina, you're muted.
Sorry, we'd really like to thank our two guests for joining us in spite of all the different time zones. And I'd like to introduce them really quickly. We have with us Dr. Ashraf El Fiky, who is a clinical research expert and medical officer at EMMES, and he will be providing us with all the expertise within the area of the medical response and all the updates regarding that. And also with us will be Dr. Ahmed Rostom, who is a senior financial sector specialist at the World Bank's Finance, Competitiveness and Innovation Global Practice. And he will be giving us a view into the global economy and the impact the pandemic has had and what ways we can deal with the current situation.
So I think, first of all, how are you both doing in Washington, D.C.? I mean, it's probably a very different experience from Egypt, but you know, there's a lot of events happening in Washington. How are you and your families?
Thank you for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be with you today, and things here are, as almost I'm sure everyone knows, has not been that quiet recently. That said, I am delighted to be a part of this event today and speaking to everyone in my homeland, and thank you for offering us that opportunity.
Mohammed, thank you so much. Appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and Dr. Ashraf and Amina. And let me just start by thanking you and also indicate how impressed I am with your platform and how you are voicing and vocalizing the youth voice in quite an impressive way. Pleasure to be with you today, and also all regards to those who are watching us and everybody back home.
Well, thank you very much. And for those who are not aware, myself and Amina are from the Egyptian Streets team and will be your hosts today. So let's kick off with one of the most important questions that's often on people's minds and often on politicians' lips and often in headlines: the balance between the health and the economy. Dr. Ashraf, you can probably tell us a bit more on what approach needs to be taken ideally from a health perspective. And Dr. Ahmed, perhaps you can follow up with, is that appropriate for the economy? Are we risking economic impacts globally by taking a health approach as opposed to an economic approach necessarily, or is it more of a balance and trying to really even it out?
Thank you for the important question, and you're absolutely right. The real challenge now for setting policy on a micro and a macro level is how to balance the two sides of the scale, if you will, public health and preserving public health, and the economy on the global level. And I think as far as the public health is concerned, you know, there is no reference or textbook on how to deal with such a pandemic. This is, you know, one of the most unique public health challenges in recent history. I would dare to say in the past almost 100 years since the flu pandemic in 1917. Our history of engagement with such a virus is really no more than 150 days since the beginning of the year. In that regard, I think the science has made huge strides in the past 150 days, given the mass scale of that pandemic, by unlocking the genome of the virus and therefore being able to target the sequences and start developing and starting the preclinical studies for a vaccine very quickly. Clinical trials that started to address vaccine safety has started as early as March. Now, 6 months into the start of the pandemic, we are taking good, important steps forward in the clinical development of a vaccine. For example, a company like Moderna and Oxford Biomedica have announced very important steps. That said, the challenge is still there. Precautionary measures by the public, including social distancing, wearing masks, are still definitely required for a long time to come until a vaccine puts an end to this drama. I will leave the economic side to Dr. Ahmed to comment on.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ashraf, and thanks again, Mohammed, for the question. I think what I'd like to start with, I think the pandemic is highlighting the urgent need for action, both on the health and economic policy fronts. And that would require global cooperation and to cushion the consequences of what's going on, particularly on the poor and the most vulnerable. So protecting lives and livelihoods should be at the forefront of basically policies and decision-making. There is no, as Dr. Ashraf mentioned, there's no one-size-fits-all policy. So basically when we compare, and I think in a while we'll be talking about quantifying this economically. But I think that we should talk about a framework to approach this, right? So the framework is how we prioritize and how we sequence, the timing of decision-making, and also the flexibility. So I think these 4 principles from my perspective, and which also takes me to a quick caveat before I start engaging. I just got engaged really quickly on answering. So I just want to caveat that the answers that I'm providing and the insights that I'm providing is basically entirely mine as an economist. So it's not attributed to the World Bank or the institution I'm affiliated with, although I take full pride and I'm so proud to be working for that great institution. But I'll be glad to share these insights from on my behalf as an Egyptian economist by learning and by training. So anyway, so back again to the answer is that there's no one size fits all, and that we'll have to look into a framework to start with. Then we'll let me pass it on back to you, but then I think we'll have a more elaborate discussion where this is taking us. But I think at the forefront is protecting lives and livelihoods. At the forefront is the need for an urgent action when it comes to health policy and global cooperation to ensure that we protect the most vulnerable to this current unforeseen pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your response. And actually, we'll be delving deeper into a lot of the points that you mentioned in your answer later on. But for now, we want to turn quickly to Dr. Ashraf to bring things a little bit closer to home. We wanted to ask you, from your medical experience, how do you evaluate the situation in Egypt? Are we on the right path? Do you think that with the current measures, the current various medical measures being taken as well, are we on the path to flattening the curve, as they call it?
So that's the million-dollar question, and I thank you for posing that question. I'm sure it represents what's on many people's minds, all the way from the policy level down to the regular citizen and everybody in between. The curve is a biological phenomenon. There has to be a rise, there has to be a peak, and there has to be a decline. Nothing will rise forever. Nothing will peak forever. The decline will come eventually. That said, the question is how to executively, rather than biologically, curb that rise and be able to bend that curve quickly, so the peak can come quicker and sooner and lower and decline faster. In order to do that, there has to be joint efforts, whether in Egypt or in any country. There has to be a joint effort between the government and the people. the people share almost 50%, if not more, responsibility for bending that curve. Sticking to strict precautionary measures such as wearing masks and social distancing now, of course, everybody knows. That said, complete shelter in place, lockdown, is something that the government was shy from enacting for my assumption, economic reasons. The period between April 1st and the end of May, those 60 days, I believe a complete lockdown for at least 20 days would have had a positive effect on curbing that curve more efficiently, rather than perhaps leaving the way until almost 8 or 9 p.m. for people to be outdoors until the lockdown and the shelter in place started. Number two, the investigational epidemiological testing, I think, was a missed opportunity in order to understand where is and the nature of the hotspots across the country. Of course, the complete lockdown and the testing policy are both what we call time-dependent policies, meaning that their value on the ground in June, as we speak, are far less than their value if they would have been enacted earlier in April or May. At this stage, I think there are different flavors of policies. Maybe we can discuss it in further questions about now with 40,000 cases and the fact that there is more or less an overwhelm of the medical capacity with the positive cases that come for treatment, that you can't really go on an investigative testing streetwise. What can you then do in order to address that situation? We can discuss it in future questions, but certainly policies such as aggressive testing and complete lockdown, I'm afraid to say it's a bit too late at this stage to enact them.
So if it's too late, is there anything you think the Egyptian government or the Egyptian people can do to avoid a potential either catastrophe in Egypt's health system? Because, you know, there's limited numbers of hospital beds, limited numbers of medical equipment, and of course, doctors are on the front lines and there's high levels of infections among them. So I guess a lot of people are wondering, what can we actually do? And just as a follow-up to that, you mentioned a bit about testing. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about what are the different types of tests available. We hear often in the media about rapid tests as opposed to a PCR test. If you could provide some insight into that, that would be fantastic.
Thank you for the important question. So what, in the light of what I said in the answer to Mrs. Amina's question, so what can we do now? In the under the umbrella of thinking globally and acting locally, local conditions in Egypt, I think, would not be favorable and would not permit home quarantine, I think, to be effective. The policy as we speak locally over in Egypt for those early to moderate cases is to home quarantine. That policy, perhaps in other countries where the per capita square area, particularly indoors, may be accommodating, it would be positively effective. In Egypt, I believe, due to close proximity in many areas of the country and very low per capita consumption of square meterage, the luxury of having your own bedroom and your own bathroom to be isolated in for 2-3 weeks in your own apartment if you are a positive case, I think would not be effective. In fact, by giving positive cases that guidance, you're actually, I think, putting gas beside the fire, because you are limiting the positive case to transmit the infection through aerosol or through droplet infection to their household members. At this stage, if you extend the shelter in place as the government did, and it's the correct decision, until the end of the month, I think all what will happen is that the current positive cases will decline by the end of the month, and then by the end of the month you'll have new cases who are the contacts in the household of the current positive cases. I think if the government, which is what Vietnam did, by the way, can arrange either through prefabricated facilities or through hotels or through any facilities that can house the positive cases who may not need close day-to-day medical attentions because they are early cases anyway. You will actually separate these positive cases from the weakest link, who are their contacts, their healthy contacts at home. That way, in the upcoming 20 to 30 days, you can really bend the curve rather than just waiting for the virus to biologically decline. Regarding your second important question, the testing, PCR is the golden test. PCR is basically a test through nasopharyngeal swab. It's a bit painful, but that test detects the genetic footprint of the virus. It's a technique. PCR is a technique. It's a test that is used for detecting many, many other viruses, including hepatitis and so forth. This is the golden rule. It is a quantitative rather than a qualitative test. So it comes with a viral load, numerical value, rather than positive or negative per se. And in this way, you know if one, you're infected or not, and number two, prognostically where you are on the infection curve. That said, it's an expensive test. It requires, of course, special handling, highly trained technicians, and so forth. There are, however, rapid tests that are through the needle prick testing, which is what the Egyptian government used, for example, in the airports at the start of the outbreak when the airports were open. These are not confirmatory testing. These are tests that are used for screening. They are not as sensitive as the PCR, but the idea here is if they turn to be positive, you can actually put these positive cases aside and confirm them by PCR. That said, the access to testing is really the code word, even here in the US, to containing the virus. And I encourage the Egyptian government to really aggressively adopt that policy, because without it, you will really be blindsided about how to manage it on the ground.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashraf, for this really, really interesting response and very informative response. I'd like to turn next to Dr. Ahmed, because Dr. Ashraf was just speaking about the importance of the shelter-in-place policy and the amount of space one would need to isolate and all of that. And I wanted to ask you, so in many advanced economies, it was relatively, of course, it's not easy at all, but it was relatively easy to have shelter-in-place orders and actually manage to enforce them. But when it comes to developing countries, things are a little bit more complex when it comes to this. And the option to shelter in place is only possible for people whose jobs allow it. And this means that they might lose their jobs, or they might find themselves continuing to go to work in spite of the risk of contracting the virus. And also many of those likely to face one of these two fates will be from more vulnerable sectors of society. So what can governments of developing countries do to avoid letting these people suffer or lose their lives or livelihoods, having to choose between their lives and livelihoods so sharply?
Well, thank you so much for that. So let me just quickly turn a bit like to where we are globally, and then jump into how to deal with this. I think just to understand the context of where we are, and the current pandemic is the worst that the world has been facing since World War II. And so this is a new, the world is getting not only into crisis, but basically a plunge in the economy that is the worst in several decades. The per capita incomes, as you just mentioned, of all regions and several countries, not all, will be affected. So this is a fact. I mean, there's an interesting report that the audience might want to look at, issued recently by the World Bank in June 2020, most recently, the global economic prospects, and has some interesting analysis that might be useful to learn about that. I'll be glad to share some of that. So the most affected countries are basically those that have been subject to underlying assumption of an open economy, right? So those that have been engaged in global trade, in tourism, in commodity trade, so on and so forth. These are the most affected ones, and the most, and these are the ones that will be basically more affected by the downturn in the economy. On top of that, the global economy is about to, or expected to, plunge by around 5%, which is huge. The emerging and developing economies are implicated also, and in a baseline scenario, they might be affected by a shrinkage of almost 2.5%. The advanced economy, as just mentioned, the imposed strong lockdown measures, and the implication is somehow a 7% shrinkage in their output. So the challenge that we're currently facing is different than several ones. In 100 years' time, since the 1930s, with the global recession, across episodes of recession, including oil prices in 1970s, including the consecutive financial crises, the Latin America tequila crisis, the emerging economies in Eastern Europe, the Asian crisis, even recently the global financial crisis. These were spread across time, and they were basically evolving in particular regions or countries with some interdependence. There was transmission of shocks. We call it an economics contagion, but it's not the contagion that Dr. Ashraf talks about in humans. This is contagious across economies, contagions across economies. And then it takes a couple of years to start recovery, and then it takes full recovery course, might take several years. So there is a very, I would say, unfortunate, it's a trade-off for policy making here and for decision making here. One critical aspect of that is sticking to the advice of the health professionals, particularly when it comes to safety in social distancing, in putting on masks, so on and so forth, that would mitigate and to an extent control the spread, and would then give policymakers a bit of an ease to get people back on phases or through phases for back to the job. I mean, there are several structural, several implications on the economies themselves. The micro and small enterprises, which are based like the key engines for growth and job creation, will be implicated. There is a need for more interventions on social protection. So, I mean, the interventions here would have to be also made based on how soon we expect to contain the virus and then move towards recovery. So I'll be glad to react more also as you receive questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that touches on a few important areas that we will be discussing, but just very quickly, because this is a live interview, we thought it would be good to ask an audience question. And this question is for Dr. Ashraf El Fiky. Properly. The first question is, what is the accuracy, you did kind of touch on this, what is the accuracy percentage of the existing tests, including the PCR test? Are there any concerns about its accuracy? And secondly, if you suspect symptoms, but are if you suspect that you have COVID-19, there's some advice that says you should get tested immediately. Others say you shouldn't get tested unless you really need to. Do you suggest getting a test and helping, I guess, the government determine how many cases there are, or should people be saving these resources unless really needed to get tested?
Okay, so these are 10 questions in one. So I'll take them one question at a time, and they are all very, very important questions. I thank your audience for posing these important questions. So just like Dr. Ahmed said, what I'm discussing in this presentation focuses only on published peer-reviewed data, not on any pending or proprietary information that I may have access to due to my job. And certainly whatever I will say represent my own point of view in that regard. What is a proper test and what is not a proper test? There are tests, for example, as far as the United States is concerned, there are tests that the FDA has given what is called EUA, or Emergency Use Authorization. This is public information. The EUA authorization that has been given by the FDA includes tests that have provided what we call positive and negative controls in their preclinical testing that achieve a high degree of sensitivity and specificity. I won't go into technicalities, but sensitivity is a different thing than specificity. Usually, a good test is a test that has a sensitivity and specificity of more than 90%. Initially, in the beginning of the pandemic, the tests were much less sensitive and accurate compared to the available tests as we speak. So if I say test X or test Y has a sensitivity of 70% or an 80%, well, that depends and is different from one product compared to another. So it depends on who are the vendors, what is the type of the test, and so forth. For further information, of course, a list of the emergency approved tests by the FDA in the United States, by the European Agency, the European Medicinal Agency, and the European Union provide a comprehensive list of that. But in general, as I said many times, the PCR testing is the most accurate. That said, PCR is not a screening test. So in a country of 100 million citizens like Egypt, it is totally unpractical and obviously very, very expensive and unpractical that you would use PCR for screening. You do not use PCR for screening. PCR is a confirmatory test. So you do it as at a second stage. That said, you use the best rapid testing that you have in screening and in what we call the push policy rather than the pull policy. The policy that is currently being done is what we call the pull policy, which is you locate these tests in certain locations that are government affiliated, and you ask people who are afraid of symptoms, who are complaining of symptoms, to come and test. When the number of cases is low, as we were in early April, perhaps that may have been an effective policy. As we speak, of course, that's not an effective policy, and many cases will drop off your radar. So you have to adopt rather a push strategy where you go and you test people, and then in a randomized manner, and eventually a map of where are the hotspots will come up. Vietnam have done that. Saudi Arabia and Emirates have done that. Many countries have adopted that policy by using the proper testing philosophy, and what you do would then govern what type of test you would do. So that's as far as the testing is concerned. I think if I remember correctly, your second question was when would be best to test for an individual case? Well, it varies. We can't like draw a number and engrave a number of days in stone and say on day 3 or in day 4, do your testing. That said, it has been published and documented that there are cases that are asymptomatic who from the time they capture the virus and acquire the virus until the time they recover, they don't show any symptoms. There are certainly some cases who go through what we call a pre-symptomatic phase before the symptoms start appearing. So the asymptomatic and the pre-symptomatic have one thing in common, that they are silent. These individuals don't even know that they are sick, and therefore they don't seek testing. And if they go around the community without masks, for example, they are shedding virus and are able to infect people around them without actually they are being aware of doing that, or those who are around them. So that's why, as a public health measure, we recommend everybody to wear a mask, even though those who are not complaining of symptoms. That said, I would suggest and advise two groups of people to do testing. Number one, certainly if you start complaining of symptoms. Number two, if you know that you've been in a close contact with a positive case, even though you are not complaining of symptoms, regardless of the number of days. And we'll take it from there.
Thank you so much. There has been so much interesting and useful information in this. I wasn't, for instance, aware that the PCR is separate from other screening tests, and I think that this is going to be really, really useful for our viewers. But our next question will also be an audience question, but this time it will be directed at Dr. Ahmed. And we wanted to ask, so a member of the audience has asked whether there will be more international cooperation as a result of this pandemic, which reminded me personally of a lot of things I've read about economists suggesting that one of the economic results of this pandemic will actually be deglobalization and more attempts at self-reliance between different countries because of how the global supply chain kind of buckled under the weight of the pandemic. And I would love to know what you think about this.
Okay, so thank you, appreciate it, thanks. So let me just quickly here also just respond to this by mentioning that at this stage, it's too early to judge, let me put it that way, right? Because I think what we are witnessing right now is basically an exceptionally high uncertainty on all fronts, right? So I think people, as we say, they're putting, or some of the assumptions putting the wagon ahead of the horse. I mean, there is an unprecedented crisis. And basically, as implications of this, we've seen massive responses that has been also unprecedented in terms of lockdown, closing unnecessary businesses, closing schools, and that's part of containment measures that has been taken to contain and to try to limit the spread as much as possible. All right, and as part of that, also a disruption in trade happened because the way the virus has spread and the implications of movement of banning movement on people, and until also the specialists come out with a clear interpretation where movement of goods would also have implications on the spread. I think there were definitely a huge disruption in supply chains. Again, but in economics, let me say that in the crisis economics, with most of these crises, there are opportunities, right? So with this disruption, it gives opportunities for those who are present within a particular country to rise up, like the micro and small enterprises or those firms that have been operating to rise up and to try to bridge the huge demand in the gap. But one key caveat here is that this has to be done with adhering to standards, so that the quality and the standards of bridging this gap would have to be also carefully looked at. Another critical matter here is how can we, and how we tackle this, is how can we look into the behavioral aspects and going back to fundamentals here. In terms of behavioral aspects in human behavior, but also has implications on the economics. I think there is a need to work on issues related to confidence and trust. And this is not only I don't mean any politics, I mean the behavior between humans. I mean, we're getting to a level or a stage where I want to trust the fellow human next to me, that he has his mask on, so that I have the comfort, and he has the comfort to use, let's say, public transportation or even walk on a curbside, right? So this sort of mutual trust needs to be part of of us being part of the solution rather than being more of a burden on getting this to spread further. If this trust is there, then it should be strengthened. If there is a bit of scar, then effort should be there to heal it. And if it's a bit deficient or is shaken, then it needs to be quickly rebuilt. And that's, again, I'm talking here about the human behavior as humans, because we are all into this together, right? And on top of that, I think, and this trust also then from the human side takes another aspect of perspective when it comes to economic activity, right? So we need to trust the service providers who promise to provide a service they need to provide it. Like, I'm not talking about a particular activity, but it's far. I mean, you're getting to a stage where you need to ensure that the very basics of how economic activity is or transaction is taking place needs to be put in perspective, so that we can all be part, as I mentioned, of the solution. On top of that, I think the issue of fulfilling promises, and here I don't want to sound a bit too theoretical, but the whole theory of finance and economics builds on promise, the promise of a lender to lend and a borrower to pay back, right? So I think keeping the promises also, and knowing that whenever, and that's basically triggers us to the whole moral. I don't want to be too technical, so the whole moral hazard issues, so on and so forth. But I think part of being part of the solution is to look at these very basic human behavior aspects and embrace them collectively as we move forward. Real quick, also the way that that we look. So I think I've mentioned a couple of numbers about how the global economy is performing this year, but for next year we have scenarios, as I mentioned. So hopefully, if these in a best case or a baseline scenario, if the current sort of towards the second half of this year, the bit of ease would bring a bit of more momentum. So we're looking at a global growth forecast to rebound to around 4%. So it's not, I mean, it's a bit of a challenge, but we need to understand that the more we embrace the values of mutual trust and confidence at the human level, at the behavioral level, the hopefully the faster then the getting out of this, definitely under huge uncertainty, and then huge all the caveats for all these assumptions, until hopefully, as Dr. Ashraf mentioned, Adil, we have a vaccine in place that would give the assurance for us to basically get a bit back to normal. I don't think that we'll entirely go back to normal, because we've already gone like a long way in working from homes and getting under lockdowns. I mean, our kids have been learning distantly. There are others who are definitely more in a more vulnerable situation that would need help. But I think more focus then, as we move forward, should be directed to these more vulnerable segments of our societies. I'll stop here, and I can definitely glad to interact with you guys.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rostom. I think a key theme and something that kept coming up a few times was trust. And I think trust is definitely a very important aspect. And it does also, go into the whole conversation about the medical system and the healthcare system and what governments are doing in terms of healthcare. You also mentioned vaccines, and so I'll go to Dr. Fiky on this. We've heard reports that a vaccine may be available by this fall, within the next few months. Do you think this is a realistic expectation? Do you think that we will continue going down this path of trying to contain the spread for well into 2021, or do you have a different outlook?
Thank you for the important question, and I know this question has been on the minds of many, both the public and the governments everywhere around the world. Two important things to consider in that regard. I totally do understand that many, when they listen to this topic of vaccines and vaccine development, they really don't want to listen to too many details. The main question is when. They just want to know when will that happen. So let me explain two things very simply to try to answer that question. The challenges that we live in right now, whether they are the preclinical development, the lab studies of a given vaccine and or the clinical trials on human volunteers on more mature investigational vaccines, all together under the umbrella of research, is only one of 3 blocks of challenges that we as a scientific community and as a humanity need to overcome first, prior to the vaccine reaching my arm and yours. What are these 3 blocks of challenges? People think that the only block of challenge is the research. If that investigational vaccine completely and successfully passes the research phase, then we're done. That's true. That's only the first block. The second 2 blocks, however, are number 2, the manufacturing of that vaccine. In this case, in the case of a pandemic that the world had never seen before, you need to manufacture billions with a B of doses. That surge capacity in manufacturing cannot be achieved overnight. And you also, for obvious reasons, have to wait until the trials that you're currently doing yield promising safety and efficacy signals first, before you start your surge capacity in manufacturing vaccine X or vaccine Y. Out of almost, and that's public knowledge, out of almost 150 investigational vaccine compounds, there are single digits, less than 10 of them, that have reached and moved forward in the clinical trials on human volunteers. Only perhaps 1 to 3 out of that number that reached 200 that are promising to reach a milestone of being approved. The third challenge, besides research and manufacturing, is the logistics. How are you planning to distribute that vaccine to 7 billion people? People who are not really living, all of them, in urban areas, on major streets like you and me, but those who are living in jungles, in villages, in rural areas, in the North Pole, in the South Pole, and so forth. Particularly if that vaccine requires, let's say, 4-degree temperature to be transported, so it has to be transported in coolers, that it may require a syringe for injection rather than mouth drops and so forth. So it would require additional technicalities in administering it and so forth. These challenges, manufacturing and logistics, in addition to the research phase that we're currently in, take time, take a huge amount of time. So starting from last January, when the vaccine genome has been decoded, which was the first step into developing a vaccine, take 12 to 18 months from that date for the world to overcome these 3 blocks of challenges would be a very promising duration and a record time, I think. So I've heard many reports from many sources that there may be a vaccine available by the fall. Great, but there is a lot of science by press release out there. And I'm not going to comment as a scientist on press releases. That said, I think a vaccine by the end of the year would be promising. An additional challenge that I would just like to tease people's minds with is currently a challenge that, for example, in the UK, where the Oxford University vaccine is being developed, in the UK, the number of new cases, positive cases, is declining. In order to test for a vaccine efficacy, like, for example, when I worked on the Ebola vaccine in Sierra Leone, the final phase of the approval was done in that country, was not done in the US, because there are cases there. If you have in any community a number of cases declining, then obviously it's very difficult to test the efficacy of the vaccine, because you're going to give it to volunteer X and you give placebo to volunteer Y, but there is no virus out there in order to test for the vaccine efficacy. And that takes you to a whole new dilemma where you probably have to challenge the volunteers with a virus to test the efficacy for the vaccine. And that would obviously then lengthen the development process. So that's good news that the new cases are declining in some parts of Europe, but the same side of the coin is it will be difficult to test for the efficacy in a speedy time as was expected. So yes, there are promising news on the vaccine side, but at this stage, commenting on when a vaccine will be available by a certain date is difficult, I think, from a scientist perspective to announce this early stage.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that's a good, that's great insight. And I think one question off the back of that I'd like to ask Dr. Rostom. You mentioned the challenges of developing vaccine, delivering vaccine, etc. Dr. Rostom, what is the role, I guess, of businesses in that capacity? Is there a role that any businesses or the economy, the market generally plays in that, or is it separated and it's just up to the government to kind of facilitate and try to figure it out?
Again, it's definitely, I mean, at this stage, again, it's too uncertain for everybody. Nobody has been, so there's no model answer to that. But the thing is, there have to be this sort of number one, a collaborative approach. So there are, I think, part of what you might look as the governments all over the globe are offering support packages and stimulus packages and trying to think and like scratch the heads about how to approach and how to do, like how to target, who to target. So I think, and on the other side, there are businesses that are still thinking, should they go back to business or not, and to what capacity, and so on and so forth. So again, given the huge level of uncertainty, I do understand that definitely decisions to invest more and basically would need a bit of more scrutiny on behalf of the investors. But then comes the role here of the state. But and this also took, I mean, again, it's a trade-off. Let me just quickly, just theoretically do a quick crash exercise on Economics 101. When we used to solve back in the Economics 101 courses for undergrads or even high school, when we are confronted with how to resolve economic problems within an economy, we use it as a very simplistic framework because this can be too complicated, and then people start assigning these to schools of thought. But I'm just trying to hear, you know, with abstraction, as you say. We have firms, we have households, and we have a planner, like an economic planner. And each of them go through what's called a constraint optimization problem. So in a layman language, in very human's language, this constraint optimization means that each of them has an objective that they're trying to maximize, but they have constraints. So the firms are using labor and capital to produce, but then they are constrained basically in production by their costs, so on and so forth, which is exactly what you're saying, Mohammed, here. The households are, they want to maximize the utility of the consumption, but they have also a constraint, which is income. And it takes me to the question that Amina has raised, like how should we react to this? And then you have the planner, which have limited resources, but then it's trying to maximize welfare. So the trade-offs here in an excessively constrained environment that the one that we're living here would require a lot of trade-offs, and it's not a one solution that we can have for that economic problem. So, I mean, here, governments might be having, I mean, you have some that have fiscal space that they can mobilize resources and then provide stimulus packages. They'll have to prioritize that between health and between supporting the private sector. Then when they support the private sector, so the whole private sector, particularly micro and small enterprises that I mentioned, which are the job engines, engines for jobs and growth, they are affected. So which ones? So what is the tough call here? How do you prioritize? So should we start with the viable ones, the ones that have been a bit more resilient to ensure that they can keep the jobs that they're offering, and back to Amina's question, try to bridge this gap due to the supply chain disruption. So that's one scenario that one can consider. So as part of that, with that targeted approach to support micro and small enterprises, viable ones, would then have some sort of incentives to align the incentives here, so they have to retain jobs as part of that. They'll have to invest a bit in the safety of their employees, and also invest in the safety of their customers, especially if they're open to customers. And if you approach, and Dr. Ashraf can confirm that, if you approach retail stores now, I mean, everybody was on lockdown for quite a period of time here. It took us a while to even get back to the habit of heading to retail stores. And when we went back here, so you found some investments in using plastic shields, where the service provider is basically shielding himself from the consumer. That's an investment. That's an investment. So, and that's part of the joint accountability and joint responsibility. But then comes, that's part of the joint, and it takes me also to the point that I raised earlier on the promises. So these firms might need to invest on their own, or they might need access some capital. So again, it takes us to the borrower-lender sort of promise and maintaining a promise. So they have, if they borrow, they have to pay back, so that then others can benefit. And you start then trickling down from the viable to the bit that the ones that were a bit more vulnerable, so on and so forth, until we get the economy back to strength. Real quick on the globalization question, Amina, I might have touched that a bit, but I think we need a bit also, I mean, given uncertainty, we need to give that a bit of time until we regain trust, right? And then we have a clear framework of how and get the commodities to move back again and start to see markets. They function when, I mean, basically with the profit maximization motivation of the firms that we just mentioned. Markets will function. Markets might adjust, right? And I'm saying might, so I'm not saying for sure, because there's no certain question to any. And people will need to get used to uncertain questions, seeing some reactions that give us an answer, but there is no correct answer. We'll have to work with scenarios. We'll have to adjust. And we'll take into what I mentioned earlier. We'll have to be a bit flexible. We'll have to prioritize, and we'll have to sequence. On global, it might, I mean, again, there's no right fix, there's no quick fix. We'll have to test. It might be a bit within, as I mentioned, so you use the current existing production capacity within an economy to rebuild or get the economic momentum to roll. You might have at a regional, maybe a bit by bit, we're hearing some countries are reopening, reopening in a week time. So this can also be part of, testing waters, what the implications would be. So people will start to move, then commodities start to move, and then we see whether that remain at a regional level, or or hopefully it's restored at the regional level, and then partly restored at the global level. So again, no clear answer and no clear timeline because the uncertainty is unprecedented. So we have to work with the scenarios, and we have to be, again, part of the solution rather than waiting for the solution. So just a quick answer here to a couple of things that I didn't tackle on, but again, we need to be a bit, given the context, we need to be also adaptive to scenarios and to work with scenarios and be flexible with scenarios. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rostom. My next question is going to touch on some of on some points that you've both made, whether that be when you earlier mentioned that things won't be exactly the way they were before. For instance, we've already started getting into the habit of working from home, and the new normal, shall we call it? I think this is a term that Mohammed Al-Aryan coined back in 2008 or something. The new normal will be different from what we knew before, and I wanted to ask you both this question, and I'd be grateful for an answer from both an economist's perspective and a medical expert's perspective. Since there are no clear signs of a vaccine being ready anytime in the very immediate future, as Dr. Ashraf suggested earlier, what do you think? A lot of people are saying that we need to learn to coexist with the virus. And of course, there are different interpretations of this phrase. A lot of people are taking it as, okay, we need to coexist with the virus, so live our lives as we did before while the virus exists. But I don't think that this is exactly what's being suggested. So I wanted to know, let's start maybe with Dr. Ahmed Rostom and then with Dr. Ashraf El Fiky. What are the different ways in which we can learn to coexist with the presence of the virus and yet still kickstart our lives and not be in a total induced standstill?
Thank you. I mean, it's an excellent question, and also takes me to a point that in the midst, like all these interesting thoughts that we wanted to share, but it takes me, I think, to I need to talk about the role of technology, because I think our interaction today is basically embracing a mean of communication that hasn't been there for a while. I mean, it was used. We used to use it for meetings and for discussions at some scale, but I think technology now is being leveraged at a higher scale than ever before. I don't only mean that for communication, I mean for learning. I mean the distance learning for kids at school. And again, it takes me then to the need of how we will shape and policymakers will shape investment in human capital, particularly for the poor and vulnerable. And on top of that, so not only investment in that, and investment in the infrastructure that would enable the poor and vulnerable to get access to that, particularly in remote areas. So so that's I think something that needs to be one needs to be mindful of. In the area that I've also has worked on a bit is the issue of digital payments and leveraging digital technology. So part of getting the ball rolling in the economy is to embrace digital technology and digital payments. And here, with all the discussions on whether use like how physical cash might be a bit risky, so on and so forth, I think, and also on the other side, the need to target and know whom are we targeting, whether it be micro and small enterprises or an individual that's trying to be you're targeting for social transfer for subsistence and support. I think there is a huge potential here for digital payments, but this is also subjective. Again, there is no clear-cut answer. Right? So this is subject to the need to assess carefully what at the like country by country, it's not one size fits all. So at the country level, we understand what level of the payments infrastructure that is existing, what can be pragmatically mobilized to enhance coverage and to quickly roll that out. If it's on the demand side for outreach to the vulnerable in terms of individuals, we will have also to work with the service providers, so the merchants. So they had what we call in our terminology merchant acceptance. So merchants hopefully should be part of that as well. It's a collective solution. So merchant acceptance should be also leveraged so that they can accept digital payments instead of cash. And then the question I know would rise is like areas that you have illiterate people who cannot cope with this technology, remote areas that the coverage is weak. So again, it trickles for where the upstream investments should be located and what do we prioritize. If we see that as a feasible alternative, then and as part of a future solution, investing in digital infrastructure, then and particularly doing it not only for for payments, sterling, so on and so forth. So this is then an area that needs to be leveraged. So I think a lot of thought has to be put on as we now in the containment process. I think a lot of thought should be put on, and I think several countries are basically doing that. Is how can we leverage, for example, as I mentioned, digital payments to enhance coverage and to reach out to the poor and to the vulnerable and to educate them. So it's an investment in infrastructure. It's getting the private sector to be part of it, but then also a role to educate the people and to educate and this is also a role where civil service society our NGOs can play a role into educating people to accept these means of payments, both on merchant sides and also on the demand side, so that we can get the ball rolling on the economy. So and again, that's quickly on top of my mind, but I'll be glad to interact more to this. Thank you.
Dr. Ashraf, if you could tell us from a medical perspective how you think that we could safely learn to coexist with the presence of the virus for the time being?
So that's an important question. Certainly, there are medically speaking, there are two shapes of recovery. There is the L-like recovery, where you basically, reach flat bottom and continue to plateau at the lower leg of the letter L, continue to plateau at that flat bottom, which is a scenario certainly medically that, and in a public health manner, we do not want. And there may be a W-like manner of recovery where you would go down with the cases, then you would experience a second wave, and then you would go down with the cases, and then you experience a third wave. So we do not want, either shapes of recoveries. We actually want an inverted U, where the cases would rise, reach a peak, and then go down. So how to avoid an L or a W-like recovery and reach an inverted U recovery, where you reach a peak and then you go down. In the current status, where you have a virulent virus You have and put 3-4 lines under the word virulent virus. There are many viruses out there, but are not as virulent. You know, the influenza virus is out there, but my immune system and yours can tolerate it pretty well if we get sick. Some may not even get vaccinated. Some may get vaccinated and still get sick and still tolerate it, and so forth. So once that virus has a reduced virulence, a virulence that is so reduced that my immune system and yours can tolerate it, we will then be able medically to reach that coexistence phase. In my point of view, the global level, and certainly Egypt is not an exception, we have not reached that medical coexistence yet. I mean, the virus still kills people. It's obvious, you know. The virus still infects, according to the Ministry of Health numbers in Egypt, 1,500 new cases a day, which is a new infection per minute. That's the government's numbers. So it is very difficult to coexist with such a monster unless there are certain policies that are enacted until that virulence is reduced or there is a vaccine. There is no third scenario. So how are we going to coexist with a virulent, monstrous enemy that you don't even see? An enemy that infects a patient per minute in Egypt and kills good 6-7% of them. Besides the precautionary measures that the government has enacted, which are certainly good steps, I think, as I said earlier, now that lockdown, I think, is too late and would no longer be effective on a national local scale, that we need to separate the active cases from their healthy contacts at home. The policy of asking early, mild to moderate cases, positive cases, to quarantine at home, I think, and I hope I'm wrong, but you know, I'm in the field. I worked on various viruses before. I didn't read a book and then just come up and say that advice. The fact that you ask people to home quarantine while they're sick, you're putting gas beside fire. You are, because they will eventually, inevitably transmit through droplet and aerosol infection the virus to their healthy household members. Separating the positive cases for the next 30 days, separating these positive cases in specialized, prefabricated, humane, non-medical quarantine, and making sure that they stay there for 2-3 weeks until they are positive, until they are negative. You save 5 to 6 to 7 times as many people who constitute their healthy, non-infective contacts in home who would otherwise be subject for infection. And then when you bend the curve and inverted U, then we can talk about coexistence with a virus that is not virulent any longer.
Thank you. I think that touches on a lot of very important questions, and you know, a lot of the headlines we see in the media, especially, and I think that provides a really important insight. On a very side note, it's one of the kind of comments I've noticed in the audience, and this is to Dr. El Fiky. There's quite a few myths about the virus out there that are perpetuated by various people, whether it's unnamed officials, unnamed academics, etc. One of these myths is that the virus is weaker in very hot weather, such as what Egypt, for example, is facing now. And the other is that it is getting weaker over time. Do you have any comments on these two statements? Is that fact in your opinion, or is it too early to tell to make a definitive kind of response on that?
So the correct answer as of June 13th, I mean, the answer may be different on July 13th or on August 13th, which is my birthday actually. But the correct answer on June 13th, today's date, is that scientifically we do not know whether higher temperature negatively affect the virus transmission, and whether the virus is getting weaker. Certainly, we're seeing the virus popping up in huge numbers in Brazil, in Peru, in Latin America, and so forth. So I don't think temperature has that significantly higher effect, reduced effect on the virus, reduced transmission. And if it may, that doesn't negate the potential of this virus popping up again once the temperature becomes colder in the fall and the winter. That said, and on the tail of your question, many have discussed herd immunity and whether just in the absence of a vaccine, propagating herd immunity would be a good thing. I want to let people know. So for those non-specialists who are unaware of what herd immunity is, hygiene hypothesis, it's a concept in immunology books that the immune system of a kid in sub-Saharan Africa is stronger than the immune system of a kid in Switzerland. That's a fact, due to more significant exposure to pathogens and microbes and so forth, that quote unquote educates the immune system to be more accommodating, rather than living in a bubble where you're away from or shielded from all these microbes. In order to get herd immunity, there are two scenarios, there are two tracks to lead to that. Either 70% of the population gets vaccinated, so the chances of the remaining 30% to get infected are very low because everybody else is vaccinated and protected, or 70% of the population get infected and they have antibodies naturally. Problem is, with a virus that leads to 6% death rate and 20% plus hospitalization, with all the health and the economic and the socioeconomic impact of it, in a country like Egypt, in order to reach herd immunity, 70 million people have to get infected first. The fallout of that number from death rates and hospitalizations will overwhelm the local medical system and healthcare system. You can't afford to reach that number. So the idea of herd immunity is not an effective one either. So betting on the concept of herd immunity or betting on the temperature may by itself result in a proper management of a situation. It is, I think, a bet that requires to be revisited.
Thank you so much for this informative response. And I also wanted to say happy birthday in advance. I know it's still a while away, but since you mentioned it, and I'm right. An August baby too, so we'll be celebrating around similar yes. times. Right. Yeah, I'm a Virgo actually.
Okay.
But I wanted to use one of the metaphors that you've used, but take it and transfer it into the economic understanding of it, because you did mention, Dr. Ashraf did mention the curve of the virus, and he used letters to describe them. And my question is now going to be to Dr. Ahmed, because similar letters have also been used to describe economic activity and growth. And the U and the V and the W-shaped curve has, I mean, U and V have been famous to describe the recovery processes of crises, but W was also new, and it also came about due to the idea of the resurgence of the disease. And I wanted to ask you how you evaluate what place of the curve we currently are. Are we in crisis? And if so, are we in recovery, or are we still in containment? Are we a U, or have we gone to a V while I wasn't paying attention? or is it what they call what now people are referring to a tick mark, where it's a sharp decline and then a more gradual rise? How do you describe it?
Thank you, appreciate it. So as I mentioned, Amina, and earlier, and be glad to elaborate that more. It's basically with the level of uncertainty, we're working with scenarios, right? So, I mean, if we're talking 2019, there was some growth momentum achieved at the global level. And then most probably 2020, the baseline is saying a drop of 5%. Now, and definitely driven by the earlier lockdowns in the first 6 months of the current calendar year. As we proceed, scenario analysis is either, as you mentioned, it might be. So based on how the ease of restrictions towards the second half of the current year would play out, would definitely be the realization of what it would look like. So the prospects is that it rebounds back hopefully globally to 4.2%. This will definitely be asymmetric across regions and but we're talking from a global perspective, given the level of uncertainty. There is definitely a pessimistic scenario, is that it can plunge a bit if the lockdown would have more severe implications, or the slowdown does not basically persist. Then it can go in a pessimistic scenario as the global economy to shrink as much as 8% next year if the recovery would be sluggish. So it's still between the tick and a W. We're hopeful that based on, so for usually what the economic crisis literature tells us is that you work with what's called leading indicators, because it's very tough to especially in the current context with the lockdown. I mean, with the lockdown, I've been doing research now for most of my career on top of my affiliation back home and here. I'm seeing data, and basically I work time series econometrics. So the data that we're envisaging right now with the slide, I mean, it hasn't been envisaged before, and there is some interesting graphs in the Global Economic Prospects report that the audience can look at about how this time is really different. I mean, I'm borrowing what Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt mentioned. And during the financial crisis, they had an interesting book called "This Time is Different." And given that the financial crisis, really the implications was really unforeseen. But then I read in Bloomberg 2 weeks ago that they reconvened and they're seeing that this time is really different. It's not that I'm saying this with Habba, but I'm mentioning it with Reed, but hopefully, again, with the collaboration, with the trust, with this, I think it is basically the need to go back to initially to our human values and embrace it, to be part again. And this is what I strongly believe, to be part of that solution is the need to work together on that. Whether it will be a U or a V, let's hope for the best. And let's hope that the ease down, I think I mean, Dr. Ashraf can comment if it would have implications on numbers, but how would that translate in terms of the capacity in the healthcare that has been also eased a bit because the numbers declined a bit. So whether this pickup will constrain it again, or with whatever the elaborate answer that Dr. Ashraf just mentioned, or the herd immunity will make people a bit more resilient. So it's a bit uncertain from the economic side, at least. I cannot comment on the medical side, but with the uncertainty and the scenarios, yes, there are basically so far 2 scenarios there, and with how it plays up in the next 2 to 3 months, I think the baseline and unfortunately the downside risk is giving us a band. And we'll have to get used to working with bands for that. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're actually, it's been more than an hour and 15 minutes. So maybe there's so many questions I'm sure all of us have, and that me and Amina also have. In fact, there's been more than 100 comments throughout this live feed. So there's plenty of material to go through, but perhaps we'll just move to, I guess, closing remarks from both of you. And I guess the question we want to pose both of you is, if you could provide perhaps up to 3 pieces of advice or final messages to everyday people, to businesses globally and locally within Egypt, and to authorities or people in charge, what would those final messages or pieces of advice or any other remarks that you would like to provide. Perhaps Dr. Ashraf El Fiky, you'd like to start.
Thank you for the questions, and it certainly have been one of the fastest 75 minutes I've ever experienced. And thanks to your hosting of this event and to Dr. Ahmed's important remarks and flawless explanation of what's going on, really. You pose an important question. We're doing this, whether me and I'm sure Dr. Rostom, not to showcase our knowledge or exercise our muscle. We're doing this to inform and advise and help. And that's the real objective of what we do. As far as I'm concerned, that has really been my cause since day one. So in that regard, and in the light of your important questions, my advice to authorities and my advice to the public. And let me start by my advice to authorities as of June 13th, because certainly it's different than my advice on April 1st. There are many policies that adopting it at this stage would have less value in the light of the current caseload compared to the early stages of the epidemic. And I want to stress that my advice to authorities is by no means critiquing their very, very important and very honest effort to drive the country into the safe side. I totally appreciate certainly what's going on and the hard work that they do. My advice in that regard would be, as of today's date, is to number one, and I think I mentioned this within the text of my remarks. Number one is not to simply wait until June 30th, which is the end of the current partial lockdown, for the virus to biologically decline. This may not necessarily happen. There has to be executive policies during the remaining 20 days prior to that current partial lockdown ends. The main policy that I urge the government to do is to quarantine and isolate active mild to moderate cases away from their household contacts, from their household healthy contacts. I mean, the severe late cases are already hospitalized. But the mild and the moderate cases, advising them to home quarantine, I think is leading to fire 10, 14, 15 days later by their healthy contacts popping up as new positive cases. So that's my advice number one. My advice number two is to adopt aggressive field testing policy. Saudi Arabia has done that, Emirates has done that, Vietnam has done that, South Korea has done that, and without that aggressive field testing policy, you will not be able to close the faucet, if you will. What you're doing now by treating patients, you're drying the wet ground, but the faucet is still open. You have to first turn off the faucet. My advice to the public, certainly the precautionary measures that have been taken by wearing masks and social distancing are very, very important. Many claim that the awareness of the Egyptian public is lower than country X or country Y. I am totally against that. Egyptian people are extremely civilized people. And if they are aware of the gravity of the situation, they certainly will not hesitate to be a strong partner into eradicating this pandemic at the local level. I am totally confident that people in Egypt are sophisticated enough and intellectual enough and aware enough that these policies are for the sake not only of themselves, but of their loved ones as well. And if there is a final remark, which is not my cup of tea, but if there is a final remark that I can add, is that public communication from the top down, public communication, daily, interactive, not one way, but daily interactive communication from the policymakers to the public daily should exist and should be very clear and transparent and should be engaging and honest and open in order for everyone to be on the same bandwagon. And I think this is a point that needs to be revisited. And finally, I thank you so much for offering me the opportunity to say my 2 cents. And I thank your audience for logging in and posing very important questions. And I leave the floor to Dr. Rostom.
Again, let me thank you again, Mohammed and Amina, for this invitation. Dr. Ashraf, it was a privilege and pleasure to sit with you on this. I don't want to repeat myself. I think I've shared some of my thoughts earlier. But in economics is a human science, and part of that for the economies to have the right policies and to rebound, we need to get back and to revisit the fundamentals and consider the fundamentals and learn. And there's no problem in learning. We're still learning a lot. This is unprecedented, as I mentioned. There's huge uncertainty and barely a right answer there. But it's critical to learn. It's critical to embrace, as I mentioned. I'll keep saying this. It's critical to mention that we need to work more on trust. Not only at the individual level, at the private sector level, but at the global level. We need to embrace that. We need to restore that. We need to strengthen that. Collaboration and collective action is really required. We're all in this together. So this is really critical. I think there, in terms of economic policy, there is, again, I mentioned that all the economies globally are under huge stress, particularly when it comes to decision making on allocating resources at national level. So I think policymakers are taking a lot of tough choices. I mean, just before this crisis erupted, there were several critical reports on how the global debt is heightened, corporate debt and so on. This even made it a bit more challenging with the cost of global funding and the sovereigns facing huge challenges. This is really affecting, I guess, how the perception is, and also creating a lot of need to collectively think to work on that together. Again, this is not a World Bank prescription. It's an Egyptian economist perspective who grew in Egypt and who learned from Egypt. I took the pride of graduating from Faculty of Economics in Cairo University. So again, I hope it's taken at that level from Egyptian economists or anything else. But let's work on this together. Let's embrace humanity and let's work on trust, confidence, and mutual cooperation and accountability. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much for your time and for your incredibly valuable input. It's really been, I agree with Dr. Ashraf, it's been a really quick 75 minutes. And we also really want to thank everyone who's tuned in and everyone who will be watching this video, because it's going to stay on our page, obviously, after it's over. And we'd also like to hear from our audience when you, in the comments, and also maybe from Dr. Ashraf and Dr. Ahmed. Who would you like to hear from us next? I mean, this was our very first attempt at a live video, and of course, we'd love to hear what our audience think, and let us know who you'd want to see. Dr. Ashraf, Dr. Ahmed, any suggestions?
You're asking me?
If you have any suggestions, who would you like to hear from? We're taking all the thoughts.
Well, certainly.
You think isn't, I guess, heard enough?
Well, I certainly would like to hear from, Bill Gates. I think you guys are quite capable, and your audience are quite capable of grilling the guy, and understanding what is his perspective, given his global outreach in many areas, including India and Bangladesh and the developing world, as far as this is concerned. And I certainly would love to see Egypt's Prime Minister, quite a capable man, being your guest the upcoming time and understanding more about his objective of managing the situation on the ground. And I totally, appreciate the very, very keen efforts that he's leading to contain the situation on the ground.
Again, let me, in my final remark, thank you, Mohammed and Amina, again, and the audience. I think it's quite an intriguing discussion. I really enjoyed it a lot. I think there are a lot of prominent economists that can also can be part of that discussion. I think on top of quickly of my mind for sure is Mohyeddin and Dr. Mohammed Al-Aryan, who are extremely knowledgeable and also have been providing very insightful thoughts on how this is turning out and what to do next, and particularly with the Egyptian sentiment involved. I think we can definitely add a lot to this discussion and contribute a lot. But thank you again. I mean, what you're doing is really good. Keep the great work on, and the great job. It's a privilege to be here with you.
And always, there's another suggestion is you can always host us both again.
We would love to. That would be our pleasure.
And I think there was one comment saying that there should be a second part of this. So
right.
Perhaps we can repeat this again if you're both up to it.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Ahmed Rostom and Dr. Ashraf El Fiky. Thank you everyone for tuning in. And this marks the end of our first ever Facebook Live. Please let us know if you have any feedback, and we look forward to reading all your comments and staying in touch. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.